what you're saying is very true. So I can give you examples of that. You know, there is the example of in Canada, over indigenous people. Now, I don't know if you people in Germany hear much about that, but in Canada, the addicted people that I worked with, 30% of them were indigenous people. They make up 4% of the Canadian population. In Canadian jails, 30% of the people are indigenous. They make up 4% of the population. Out of all the women in jail in Canada, 50% are indigenous. They make up 4% of the population. And the trauma that they underwent for over 100 years, the children were abducted from their homes. They were taken to residential schools run by the churches. 3 weeks ago, Pope Francis apologized. A group of Canadian indigenous people went to the Vatican and they met with him, and he said this apology. And let me tell you, it's the worst apology I've heard in my whole life. He said, "I'm so sorry for what some Catholics do to your people." What some Catholics did was to torture children for speaking their own language, sexually abuse them, beat them, put them in cages, starve them. Thousands died. They're finding the bodies now. And it wasn't some Catholics, it was the church that did it, that collaborated with the Canadian state to abduct Canadian and Indian children with the idea of getting rid of the Indian in the Indian, as they said it. Amongst these people, there are high rates of addiction, high rates of suicide, high rates of mental illness, high rates of physical illness. As I mentioned to the crowd earlier, if you're an indigenous woman, your chance of having rheumatoid arthritis are 6 times greater than average. This is amongst a population that never used to have rheumatoid arthritis. Deep collective trauma. And it's ongoing, because we haven't finished taking their lands yet. We still want it for oil, and we want their trees, and we want their lands, we want their water. So it's still going on. So the trauma isn't only in the past, it's ongoing. That's one example. The other example of deep collective trauma, where you can see it right now in the Ukraine. Third example, in a month I'll be going to Palestine, work with Palestinians. And this woman I'll be working with, she told me that where we live, there's no post-traumatic stress disorder because the trauma is never post. It's still going on. Lots of places in the world like that. So the question is it possible to heal in that context? Yes. This woman, Ashira, that is inviting me to go to Palestine, she's done a lot of work on her own healing, even though the trauma is still going on. I know a lot of indigenous people in Canada who have become great leaders and spiritual teachers and healers, despite the fact that the collective trauma is going on. I know black people in the United States who are sometimes kept in solitary confinement for years, and they've done tremendous healing. So I think the response to your question is, we have to acknowledge the collective trauma and never forget about it, and to keep paying attention to it, but we can't wait for it to be over to start healing individually. So yes, it is possible to heal individually, even in the midst of collective trauma. Without forgetting about the collective trauma, we can't wait for it to be over until we begin the work ourselves. Does that answer your question?
It's good to know that it's possible, and I guess the question is how do you endure that feeling?
How do you do it?
How do you endure it? You know, that you're in the trauma and it's still happening.
Well, because the collective trauma shows up in your body. It shows up in your soul, and it shows up in your mind. It shows up in your relationships with your friends and your partners and your children. And so you can heal it. When you say how, I can't give you a 1-minute lecture on how to heal trauma, but the way I do the work, there's the way other teachers, Bessel, Van der Kolk, Peter Levine does the work, there's the way indigenous traditions around the world do the work. There's lots of other, there's lots of modalities, lots of methods. The main thing to realize is that it's possible. Because, you see, trauma is not the terrible things that happen to people. That's not the trauma. The trauma is what happens inside people as a result of what happened to them. So the trauma is the wound that you're carrying. I don't care what the source is. Not that I don't care, but regardless of what the source is, the trauma is what you're carrying inside. It's the wound that you have. And that wound can always be healed. That can happen. How? That depends where you live, what resources you have, what help is available, what appeals to you.